She was the quietest nurse on the floor. Nobody argued with that. She kept her head down. She kept her voice low. She kept her sleeves long, even in August. For 6 years, she had been nobody. That was the plan. Her name tag read Sarah Ellison. It was not her real name. Nobody at Ashford Memorial knew her real name. Nobody knew what she had done with it, either, or the men she had done it for, or the ones she had carried out of places most people couldn't find on a map. She emptied bedpans. She restocked gauze. She smiled the smile of a woman who had never raised her voice in her life. Then, on a Tuesday morning in March, a gurney came screaming through the doors with a man on it who should have been dead already, and he said a word only 3 living people were supposed to know. The room went still. Sarah's hands did not shake. That was the first sign something was wrong with the story everyone thought they knew about her. Ashford Memorial sat on the edge of a mid-sized city in Ohio, the kind of place where the biggest news most weeks was a grocery store opening or closing. Gray brick, fluorescent lights that buzzed faintly at 2 a.m., linoleum floors scuffed pale by decades of gurney wheels. It was an unremarkable hospital in an unremarkable town, and that was exactly why Sarah had chosen it. She was 34 years old, though most of her co-workers guessed older, because of her eyes. They were flat and gray and gave away nothing. There was a scar along her left forearm, thin and old, that she told people was from a bad fall off a bike as a teenager. It was not from a bike. There was another scar, smaller, just beneath her collarbone, that she never explained at all, because nobody ever asked. She moved through the hospital the way she had once moved through buildings that weren't supposed to have anyone left alive inside them. Quiet, economical, never wasting a step. Nobody noticed that. Nobody was trained to notice that. Nobody except, maybe, the man in room 214. She had learned, a long time ago, that the fastest way to survive was to make herself small. Small enough that nobody looked twice. Small enough that nobody asked questions. In the world she came from, questions got people killed. In this world, questions just got you fired or worse, remembered. And Sarah Ellison did not want to be remembered. That was harder than it sounded, because Dr. Marcus Klein had made a hobby out of remembering her, specifically, remembering every mistake he imagined she'd made, real or invented. Klein was the head of emergency medicine at Ashford Memorial, and he wore his title the way some men wore a uniform 2 sizes too big, puffing his chest out to fill the space. He had trained at a name-brand school. He mentioned it often. He had a laugh that came out sharp and performative whenever someone above him was in earshot, and a voice that turned cold and clipped the moment it wasn't. Ellison. He said her name like it was something stuck to his shoe. I don't recall asking a nurse's aide for a diagnosis. He said it in front of a full nurse's station once, because she had quietly mentioned, quietly, respectfully, that a patient's pupils weren't tracking evenly. He'd waved her off. 2 hours later a neurologist confirmed the bleed she'd flagged. Klein never apologized. He simply stopped making eye contact with her for a week, which she counted as a win. Do not contradict him in front of patients, she reminded herself, the way she reminded herself every morning, like checking a weapon before a patrol. Do not mention what you already know. Do not make him look small in front of people he answers to. 3 rules. She had lived by fewer, once, and it had nearly gotten her killed. There was one person at Ashford who saw past the flat eyes and the folded-down posture. His name was Walter Grimes, 78 years old, a retired railroad man recovering from a hip replacement in room 209, who had a habit of watching Sarah change his forebag with an expression like he was solving a puzzle. You're not what you say you are, he told her once, not unkindly, just matter of fact, the way old men sometimes say true things without dressing them up. I had a nephew who moved the same way you do. Came back from Kandahar and never stopped checking the exits in a room. Sarah had smiled the smile that gave nothing away. I just don't like sitting with my back to the door, Mr. Grimes. He'd said and let it go. But he hadn't forgotten it. Neither had she. That Tuesday morning, none of that mattered yet. What mattered was the gurney crashing through the ambulance bay doors, and the trauma team scattering into practiced chaos, and a stranger's blood-slicked hand catching Sarah's wrist as she reached for his chart, and a word coming out of his cracked lips that hit the room like a detonation. The word hit the room like a detonation. Nobody else understood it. To the residents, the med students, even to Klein barking orders from the foot of the gurney, it sounded like delirium, the ramblings of a man in hypovolemic shock, blood pressure crashing, mind slipping sideways into nonsense. But Sarah understood it. Sarah understood it the way you understand your own name spoken in the dark. Night Stalkers. The 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment. Night helicopters, night missions, men who flew low and fast into places that didn't exist on any briefing the public would ever see. She had flown with them. She had bled with them. She had buried some of them. For 3 years, she had told herself that part of her life was a locked room. She did not open it. She did not visit it. She certainly did not expect it to come crashing through the ambulance bay doors on a Tuesday morning, wearing another man's blood. Ellison, are you just going to stand there? Klein's voice cracked across the trauma bay, sharp and performative, the kind of voice that needed an audience to work properly. Move. She moved. But something in her had already shifted, quiet and internal, like a key turning in a lock nobody was supposed to find. Before we go further, if you're just joining us, welcome back to Silent Heroes. Comment below what you think that word means to Sarah. I promise you, it's bigger than you think. And if this story's got its hooks in you already, hit that subscribe button, because it only gets heavier from here. Now, back to the trauma bay. The patient's name, according to the dog tags still looped around his neck, was Staff Sergeant Daniel Reyes, 31 years old. Gunshot wound to the abdomen, entry point just below the ribs, exit wound Messier, the kind that told you something vital had been in the way. His blood pressure was crashing. His skin had gone the color of wet paper. BP's 80/40 and dropping, a resident called out, voice cresting toward panic. He's tacky at 140. Klein stepped in, chest first, the way he always did. 2 large-bore IVs, wide open. Get me a type and cross. We'll scope for internal bleeding once he's stable. It was, on its face, a reasonable plan. It was also wrong, and Sarah knew it within 4 seconds of watching Reyes's abdomen, the subtle asymmetric distension on the left side, the way his breathing had gone shallow and guarded, the way his skin around the flank had started to bruise a deep, spreading blue-black that had no business appearing that fast. Gray Turner's sign. Retroperitoneal bleeding. He wasn't just losing blood into his abdomen. He was losing it behind it, into the space surgeons couldn't reach with a simple scope and a prayer. Wide-open fluids without controlling the source wouldn't save him. It would just help him bleed out faster, diluting what clotting factors he had left, buying him minutes instead of years. She had seen this exact injury before. Not in a textbook. In a dust-choked forward operating base outside Kandahar, on a boy not much older than Reyes, whose name she still would not let herself say out loud. Dr. Klein. Her voice was quiet. It was always quiet. That was the whole design of her. His flank is bruising. Look at the pattern, it's not superficial. I think this is retroperitoneal. Wide-open crystalloid is going to worsen a coagulopathy he's already heading into. He needs or notification now, not after a scope. Klein didn't even turn his head fully toward her. That's a big word for someone who restocks gauze, Ellison. A ripple of discomfort passed through the room, the kind nobody says anything about, but everyone feels, the air going a half-degree colder. Sir. I said I've got this. His jaw was tight. His eyes flicked, just for half a second, toward the med student holding a clipboard by the door, the one person in the room whose opinion of him mattered enough to perform 4. 2 units, wide open. Let's move. Reyes's monitor screamed a warning tone. His oxygen was dropping. His pressure was in freefall. Sarah looked down at her own hands, bracing for the tremor that always came before a crisis, the fine shake she'd trained herself to hide for 6 years, the one thing her body still did that betrayed the fear underneath the calm. It wasn't there. Her hands were steady. Her spine had straightened without her telling it to. Somewhere in the last 90 seconds, without deciding to, she had stopped being Sarah Ellison, nurse's aide who kept her head down, and started being someone else entirely, someone she had buried on purpose, in a uniform 6 years cold, who had once knelt in blood-soaked sand and made decisions nobody else in the room was qualified to make. "Sir, I need you to listen to me," she said, and her voice had changed too, flatter now, stripped of the softness she usually wore like a coat. "This man does not have time for you to be right later." The room went silent again. Klein turned, finally, fully, disbelief flickering across his face like he'd just watched the furniture start talking. "Excuse me." Behind them, Reyes's monitor flatlined its warning tone into a single, unbroken shriek. The shriek of the monitor cut through the trauma bay like a blade, and for 1 full second nobody moved. Then everybody moved at once, the wrong way. "Charge to 200, get the crash cart," Klein barked, already reaching for a defibrillator that had no business touching a man who wasn't in cardiac arrest, whose heart was simply starving for blood it no longer had. "He's not in VFib." Sarah's voice cut across the chaos, flat and certain. "That's a PEA arrest. His heart has electrical activity, it has nothing to pump. Shocking him does nothing. He needs volume control and a source of bleeding stopped, now, or he is going to die on this table in front of all of us." For half a heartbeat, even Klein hesitated. It was the hesitation of a man who, deep down, in the part of himself he never let anyone see, suspected he was wrong and didn't know how to stop being wrong in front of an audience. Sarah didn't wait for him to find his footing again. She stepped past him. Not shoved, not dramatic, just a clean, decisive step that put her exactly where she needed to be, at Reyes's side, 2 fingers pressed hard into his groin, searching for a femoral pulse that was thready and fading fast. "I need a pelvic binder now," she said, to no one and everyone. "And someone start compressing his abdominal aorta manually against the spine, above the umbilicus. It's not perfect, but it'll slow the retroperitoneal bleed until we get him upstairs." A nurse near the door, young, wide-eyed, knew enough to still trust competence over rank, grabbed the binder without a second's pause and passed it over. For the people watching, and there were more people watching now, filling the doorway, drawn by the sound of the flatline, it looked like something out of a different world had walked into theirs. A woman who, an hour ago, had been quietly restocking supply carts, now had both hands buried in a dying man's abdomen, applying pressure with a precision that looked less like instinct and more like memory, the kind of memory that lives in muscle, not in thought. Retroperitoneal hemorrhage doesn't behave like the bleeding you can see. It hides. It pools where scans can miss it, where pressure and packing matter more than speed, where the instinct to simply give more fluid can actively kill a patient by diluting the clotting factors his body needs to save itself. Manual aortic compression is a bridge, not a cure, a way of buying minutes, not hours, until a surgeon can find and tie off the source. It is a technique taught in combat medicine long before it's taught in most civilian trauma bays, because on a battlefield, minutes are often the only thing standing between a soldier and a body bag. Sarah had learned it not from a manual, but from a medic named Ochoa, who had shown her exactly how to find the pressure point on a corpsman 2 ranks above her, in a helicopter thundering low over unfamiliar terrain, blood soaking through both their gloves. Ochoa hadn't made it home from that deployment. She had never forgotten the lesson. "Pressure's coming back up," someone called. 70 over 45. 82 over 50. "Keep compressing," Sarah said. "Don't ease up until the OR team has him." Klein stood a few feet away, his mouth slightly open, his authority evaporating in real time in front of the very audience he'd been performing for all morning. He looked, for the first time since Sarah had known him, genuinely small. "Where the hell?" he finally said, his voice cracking with something between fury and disbelief. "Did you learn that?" The room went quiet enough to hear the monitor's steady, strengthening beat. Reyes's pulse, thin as it was, had found its footing again. Sarah didn't look up from her hands, still holding pressure, still counting silently under her breath the way she'd counted 100 times before in places far from any hospital. "Somewhere you've never been," she said. It wasn't defiance exactly. It was simpler than that, a door she hadn't meant to open, cracking anyway, 6 years of careful invisibility spilling out through a single sentence she couldn't take back. Klein's face flushed red, embarrassment curdling fast into anger, the particular anger of a man who has just been humiliated in front of people whose respect he needs to survive professionally. "We are going to talk about this," he said, jabbing a finger toward her, "the second this patient is stable." "Fine," Sarah said. Her hands did not move. Her voice did not shake. "Talk all you want. He's not dying today." Behind Klein, half hidden near the doorway, old Walter Grimes stood in his hospital gown and 4-pole, having wandered down the hall against every instruction he'd been given, drawn by the commotion like everyone else. He watched Sarah, steady-handed, spine straight, voice stripped of its usual careful softness, and something in his weathered face settled, like a man finally seeing the last piece of a puzzle click into place. "Well, I'll be damned," he murmured to no one in particular. "Told you so." The trauma team wheeled Reyes toward the elevator bay, Sarah walking half a step behind, one hand still pressed against the binder at his hip, refusing to let go until the ore doors swallowed them both, leaving Klein standing alone in the wreckage of a trauma bay, and a reputation that had both just changed forever. The ore doors swung shut, and just like that, Sarah's world narrowed down to the width of a hallway. She stood there a moment too long, staring at the spot where the gurney had disappeared, her hands still slick and red, her heart finally, starting to hammer the way it should have 20 minutes ago. The steadiness that had carried her through the crisis was already starting to crack at the edges, the way it always did once the emergency was actually over and there was nothing left to hold it up. Not now, she told herself. Not here. She turned to find Klein waiting for her, arms crossed, flanked by the hospital's chief administrator, a tightly wounded woman named Denise Farrow, who had clearly been summoned the moment word of the Trauma Bay incident reached the front office. "My office," Klein said. "Now." The walk down the corridor felt longer than it was. Nurses she'd worked beside for years watched her pass with expressions she couldn't quite read, something between awe and confusion, like they were seeing a photograph develop into a completely different picture than the one they'd expected. "Before we go any further, if you're still with us, welcome to Silent Heroes. If you've ever watched someone get punished for being right, you know exactly the feeling coming in this next scene. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from today, and hit subscribe if you want to see how far this goes." Now back to Sarah. Klein's office was small and self-important in equal measure, diplomas mounted at deliberate eye level, a desk kept aggressively clean, as if clutter might expose something about the man sitting behind it. He didn't sit. He stood behind the desk, using it like a barricade. 6 years, he said. 6 years you've worked in my department, and I find out today that you've been lying about who you are. "I never lied about my job performance," Sarah said quietly. "I've done my job well for 6 years. You practiced medicine outside your scope. You contradicted a licensed physician in front of staff and students. You put your hands directly into a patient's abdomen without authorization." He ticked the accusations off like a grocery list, each one delivered with rising satisfaction, as though he'd been rehearsing this moment since the Trauma Bay. "That's not heroism, Ellison. That's a lawsuit waiting to happen. That's my license on the line. Not the patient's life. His license." Sarah filed that detail away, quiet and cold, the way she used to file away small inconsistencies in a briefing that would later turn out to matter. Denise Farrow, arms folded, cut in with the practiced neutrality of someone who'd spent a career smoothing things over. Regardless of the outcome, Ms. Ellison, hospital protocol requires we investigate. Effective immediately, you're suspended pending review. He's stable because of what I did, Sarah said. Her voice didn't rise. It never rose. You can suspend me. That doesn't change what would have happened if I'd stood there and let him bleed to death because Dr. Klein didn't want to be corrected in front of an audience. Klein's jaw tightened. That is a serious accusation. It's an observation. She met his eyes for the first time since walking in, and something in her gaze, flat, gray, utterly unafraid, made him look away first. I've made a career out of those. Turn in your badge, he said. You're not to be on hospital grounds until this review concludes. Sarah unclipped the badge from her scrubs and set it on the desk without a word. Her hands, she noticed distantly, were steady again. Not shaking. Not even close. No, she said. Klein blinked. Excuse me. No. The word landed flat and final, no heat behind it, just fact. I'm not leaving this building while Reyes is in surgery. If something goes wrong up there, if they need a second set of hands who actually understands what put him on that table, I am not going to be 3 miles away because you were embarrassed. You are suspended. I am done hiding, Sarah said. I am not done being useful. Those are two different things, and you clearly don't understand the difference. She turned and walked out before he could answer, leaving him standing behind his overly clean desk, badge sitting untouched on the blotter in front of him, his face flushed with the particular fury of a man who had just lost an argument he didn't know he was capable of losing. Out in the hallway, word had already spread. It always did, in a building like Ashford, where boredom and gossip moved faster than any official memo. Nurses clustered near the supply room, murmuring. A resident stood frozen mid-step, staring at Sarah like she'd just watched a painting step down off its frame. Walter Grimes was waiting by the elevator, still in his gown, for Pole rolling unevenly beside him, having apparently decided hospital rules about wandering didn't apply to him today. They suspend you? He asked. Tried to. Good, he said, with the satisfied nod of a man who'd bet on a horse and watched it come in first. Man like that needed taking down a peg. Needed it worse than that boy upstairs needed surgery, if you ask me. Sarah allowed herself, just barely, the ghost of a smile. Nobody asked you, Mr. Grimes. Nobody ever does, he said. Doesn't stop me from being right. Down the hall, through the double doors leading to the surgical wing, a small crowd had begun to gather. Nurses, a few off-duty staff, even a security guard who'd abandoned his post out of curiosity, all of them waiting, watching the elevator numbers climb, waiting to see if the quiet woman who restocked gauze had really just saved a man's life with her bare hands. None of them yet knew that the biggest reveal of the day hadn't happened yet. It was still 4 floors up, still riding in an elevator that hadn't arrived, in the shape of 2 men in dress uniforms, walking through the front doors of Ashford Memorial with a folder that had her real name printed across the front of it. By 11:40 that morning, Ashford Memorial had 2 visitors nobody in the building had been expecting. They came through the front entrance together, unhurried, moving with the kind of quiet economy that only comes from years of training your body to take up exactly the space it needs and nothing more. Dress uniforms, pressed and precise. One wore the insignia of a lieutenant colonel. The other, older, silver-haired, carried himself like a man who had spent decades being the calmest person in every room he ever walked into. The front desk receptionist, flustered, buzzed the wrong extension twice before finally getting Denise Farrow on the phone. "There are 2 military officers here," she said, voice pitched low with confusion. "They're asking for someone named, hold on." She glanced back down at the folder one of them had slid across the counter. "Captain Sarah Whitfield." Farrow's mouth went dry. "I'm sorry, who?" "Before we go further, welcome back to Silent Heroes. If you had a feeling Sarah Ellison wasn't her real name, comment, 'I knew it' below, and let's see how many of you called it early. If you haven't yet, Now's the time to hit subscribe, because what happens next is the moment this whole story turns. Back to Ashford Memorial. By the time the two officers reached the surgical waiting area, the small crowd that had gathered outside the OR had grown considerably larger, nurses on break, a few residents pretending to check charts, Walter Grimes still parked defiantly in his wheelchair despite 3 separate requests that he return to his room. Klein was there too, arms crossed, jaw set, waiting for confirmation that his authority over Sarah Ellison would be restored the moment this misunderstanding sorted itself out. It was not going to sort itself out the way he expected. The silver-haired officer scanned the room and found her immediately. Sarah, still in blood-flecked scrubs, standing near the OR doors as if she could will them open through sheer proximity. Something in his face shifted, warmth breaking through decades of discipline. "Captain Whitfield," he said. The room went silent in the particular way rooms go silent when something enormous and long buried finally breaks the surface. Sarah closed her eyes for 1 second. 6 years of careful invisibility, undone in 3 syllables. "Colonel Marsh," she said, when she opened them again. Her voice wasn't flat anymore. Cracked just slightly on the second word. "You shouldn't be here. I've been trying to find you for 2 years, Marsh said. You disappear well. I'll give you that." Klein stepped forward, some last reserve of authority driving him to insert himself into a conversation that had nothing left to do with him. "I'm sorry, Colonel, is it? This woman works for me. Nurse's aide. I don't know what mistake has been made, but—" "No mistake," Marsh said, without even glancing at him. He opened the folder in his hands, the kind of folder that had clearly been photocopied and stamped and re-stamped through more than one federal building. Captain Sarah Whitfield, 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment. Flight medic, attached to night stalker operations for 4 years. 2 bronze stars. A Purple Heart she never filed the paperwork for, which, frankly, Captain, we need to discuss. A faint, dry smile. Silver Star recommendation for actions during an extraction under fire outside Kandahar, in which she is documented as having personally stabilized and evacuated 3 wounded soldiers while under direct hostile engagement, after her own team leader was killed. The waiting room had gone completely, utterly still. Even the overhead monitors seemed to hush. "She saved my life that night," said the younger officer, the lieutenant colonel, speaking for the first time. His voice was rougher than expected, thick with something he didn't try to hide. "I was 19 years old and bleeding out in a Black Hawk, and she kept both hands inside a wound that should have killed me for 11 minutes straight until we hit the base. I didn't know her name was Whitfield until 3 years later. I only knew her call sign." He looked directly at Sarah. "Ghost," he said. "That's what we called her. Because nobody ever saw her coming, and by the time you needed her, she was already there." Klein's face had gone the color of old paper. He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. There has to be some kind of, she's a nurse's aide. She restocks supply carts. She has a Bachelor of Science in Nursing, a combat medic certification most trauma surgeons in this country couldn't pass, and roughly 4,000 more hours of live-fire trauma experience than anyone currently on your staff," Marsh said, finally turning to look at Klein directly, and his voice, though quiet, carried the unmistakable weight of a man who had spent 30 years being obeyed. "I'd suggest choosing your next sentence carefully, Doctor." The crowd had thickened further, drawn by the sound of raised voices and the sight of 2 decorated officers standing in the middle of a hospital waiting room. Someone had their phone out, recording, though nobody stopped them. She defied a direct order from her attending physician, Klein said, grasping now, his voice climbing toward the shrillness of a man watching his footing disappear beneath him in real time. "She was suspended for cause." "She was suspended," Sarah said, quiet but clear, "because a patient survived a diagnosis you got wrong, in front of witnesses, and you couldn't stand it." Marsh's eyes flicked toward Klein with new, sharpening interest. "Is that true, Doctor?" Klein said nothing. His silence, in that packed waiting room, was answer enough for everyone watching. "I think," Marsh said slowly, closing the folder with a soft, final snap, "we have quite a lot to sort out today. And I don't believe any of it favors you." Behind them, the OR doors finally swung open, and a surgeon in a blood-streaked gown stepped through, pulling down her mask, scanning the crowded waiting room until her eyes landed on Sarah. "He's going to make it," she said. "Whoever stabilized him in the trauma bay, that's the reason he's alive right now." Every eye in the room turned back to Sarah at once. For a moment, nobody spoke. The surgeon's words hung in the air, and Sarah felt the strange, dislocating pressure of an entire room finally seeing her clearly for the first time in 6 years. "He's stable," the surgeon went on, tugging off her gloves. "Retroperitoneal bleed, just like you said. If we'd waited for imaging, if we'd gone in blind without someone controlling that pressure point downstairs, he doesn't make it to my table breathing." She looked at Sarah with something like professional respect, rare and unhurried. "Who taught you that maneuver?" "The Army," Sarah said simply. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Walter Grimes, still parked in his wheelchair, allowed himself a satisfied little grunt, as if the universe had finally caught up to what he'd known for weeks. Klein, meanwhile, had gone very quiet, the particular quiet of a man doing frantic math behind his eyes, trying to calculate how much of this could still be salvaged. "Well," he said, forcing his voice back into something resembling command, "regardless of Ms. Captain Whitfield's history, hospital protocol is hospital protocol. An unauthorized intervention is an unauthorized intervention, regardless of outcome. I'll be recommending the board formally review. Dr. Klein." Denise Farrow's voice cut through his sentence, sharper than anyone had heard her use all day. She was holding her phone, and her expression had shifted from professional neutrality into something colder, more focused. "Before you recommend anything to the board, I think we need to talk. Privately." "About what?" "About the email I just received," Farrow said, "from the hospital's compliance office. Regarding a clinical trial you enrolled 4 patients in last quarter without full documented consent. Regarding a research stipend from Halcorp Pharmaceuticals that somehow never appeared on your conflict of interest disclosure." Her jaw tightened. "Regarding Staff Sergeant Reyes who, it turns out, was already on your list. Slated for the same trial. Tomorrow." The color drained from Klein's face so completely and so fast that for a moment he looked almost sympathetic, standing there in the middle of the waiting room with every eye suddenly turned toward him instead of Sarah. That is a compliance matter, that has nothing to do with." "It has everything to do with it," Farrow said. "Because if Captain Whitfield hadn't caught that bleed, Sergeant Reyes would have died on your table this afternoon, and I suspect that would have looked very convenient for a man who's been quietly padding a stalled clinical trial with combat trauma patients who can't easily say no." The waiting room, already tense, went electric. "You're reaching," Klein said, but his voice had lost its edge entirely, cracking into something thin and defensive. "I have never once compromised patient care for a grant." "Not once." "Then you won't mind the audit," Farrow said flatly. "Which starts today. Dr. Klein, you're relieved of clinical duties, effective immediately, pending a full compliance review. Security will escort you to gather your things." For one long, silent second, Klein looked around the room, at the crowd of nurses who had spent years absorbing his contempt in silence, at Marsh and the lieutenant colonel watching him with unreadable military stillness, at Sarah, steady and unmoved, at Walter Grimes wearing an expression of open, unashamed satisfaction, and something in him seemed to finally understand exactly how alone he was. "This is a witch hunt," he said, backing toward the door as 2 security guards approached. "You'll all regret this. I built this department. You built a department that let a war hero mop floors for 6 years because you were too insecure to ask her a single question about herself," Farrow said. "Take him to my office." The doors swung shut behind him, and the waiting room exhaled all at once, a collective release of tension that had been building since the moment the ambulance bay doors first burst open that morning. Sarah didn't feel triumphant. She felt, mostly, tired, the particular exhaustion of a woman who had spent 6 years building a wall around herself brick by careful brick, only to watch it come down in the space of a single Tuesday, in front of an entire hospital. Colonel Marsh stepped closer, lowering his voice so it was just for her. "There's something else, Sarah. Something I came here to tell you in private, before all this happened. It's about Ochoa." Sarah's chest tightened. "Ochoa's been dead 5 years, Colonel." "I know," Marsh said gently. "But his family finally cleared his personal effects for release last month. There was a letter in there. Addressed to you." He reached into his jacket and produced a small, worn envelope, edges soft from handling, her name written across the front in handwriting she would have recognized anywhere. "I think it's time you read it." Sarah stared at the envelope for a long moment before she took it, the paper soft and worn from 5 years of sitting somewhere in a box she'd never known existed. Ochoa. For a moment, the crowded waiting room disappeared entirely. She wasn't standing in a hospital in Ohio anymore. She was back in the belly of a Black Hawk thundering low over unfamiliar terrain, blood soaking through 2 sets of gloves, a medic 12 years her senior shouting instructions over the deafening rotor wash, teaching her, hands over hands, exactly where to press to keep a dying man alive. He had taught her everything. The aortic compression point, the pressure dressings, the calm, flat voice you used when a soldier was screaming and you needed him to trust you more than he trusted his own fear. He had also taught her the rule that had saved her life more times than she could count. You don't get to fall apart until everyone else is safe. 3 weeks after that lesson, Ochoa had died pulling a wounded gunner out of a burning vehicle. Sarah had not been there. She had never quite forgiven herself for that, no matter how many people told her there was nothing she could have done. "You don't have to read it here," Marsh said quietly. "No," Sarah said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I do." She opened the envelope with careful, deliberate hands, the same steadiness that had held pressure on Reyes's abdomen less than 2 hours earlier, and unfolded a single page of handwriting she recognized instantly, blocky and slanted, written in the particular impatient scrawl of a man who talked faster than he wrote. "Whitfield. If you're reading this, it means I didn't make it, and somebody finally got around to cleaning out my footlocker. Sorry it took them this long. Bureaucracy never dies, even when we do. I want you to know something, because I don't think I ever said it right when I had the chance. You were the best medic I ever trained, and I trained a lot of them. Not because you were fearless. You weren't, and don't let anyone tell you fearless is what makes a good medic. You were good because you were scared and you did the job anyway, every single time, hands steady even when the rest of you wasn't. One day this is going to end for you. Maybe it already has by the time you're reading this. And when it does, I need you to promise me something. Don't you dare disappear into some quiet corner of the world and let all of that go to waste. You're going to want to. I know you. You'll tell yourself it's safer that way for everybody. It's not. The world needs people who know how to stay steady when everything's falling apart. Don't hide that. Not from anybody. Take care of yourself, Captain. That's an order. Ochoa." Sarah read it twice. Her throat had gone tight, and for the first time all day, for the first time in longer than she could remember, the careful, practiced stillness in her chest cracked open completely. She didn't sob. That wasn't her. But her eyes filled, and she let them, standing there in the middle of a hospital waiting room in front of strangers and colleagues and 2 men in dress uniforms who had watched people cry before and knew better than to look away from it. "He was right," she said quietly, folding the letter carefully back along its worn creases. "I did exactly what he told me not to do." "You're not hiding anymore," Marsh said. "Not as of about 20 minutes ago." A small, unsteady laugh escaped her, more relief than humor. "No. I suppose I'm not." Walter Grimes wheeled himself a little closer, watching the whole exchange with the quiet attentiveness of a man who'd been paying closer attention to Sarah than anyone else in the building for weeks. "Your friend sounds like he knew you pretty well," he said. "He did," Sarah said. "Better than most people ever have." "Well," Grimes said, "for what it's worth, I think he'd be real proud of what you did in that trauma bay today." Sarah looked down at the old man, this stranger who'd noticed something true about her long before anyone else bothered to look, and something in her chest loosened just slightly further. "Thank you, Mr. Grimes." "Don't thank me," he said, waving a dismissive hand. "Told you so is thanks enough." Marsh cleared his throat gently. "There's more we need to discuss, Captain. Farrow's compliance office isn't the only thing looking into Klein right now. What he was doing with that clinical trial, it goes further than a stalled grant and a few missing signatures. We've had eyes on Halcorp Pharmaceuticals for the better part of a year." His expression hardened. "And I don't think Reyes ending up on that trauma table today was an accident." Sarah's grief, still raw and close to the surface, sharpened suddenly into something colder, more familiar, the particular focus she'd once reserved for briefings that meant somebody, somewhere, was about to be in very serious danger. "What do you mean, not an accident?" Marsh glanced around the crowded waiting room, nurses still lingering, a security guard hovering near the doors, Walter Grimes leaning in with open curiosity, and gestured toward a quieter alcove near the vending machines. "5 minutes," he said. "Then I'll explain everything." Sarah followed, the lieutenant colonel trailing behind, and Farrow joined them a moment later, phone still in hand, expression tight. "Reyes wasn't a random trauma case," Marsh said, once they were out of easy earshot. "He was a whistleblower. 6 weeks ago, he filed a formal complaint with the Inspector General's office alleging that a research contractor, Halcorp Pharmaceuticals, was running an unauthorized trial on wounded veterans discharged through this hospital's network. Experimental clotting agent. No proper consent. No oversight." His jaw tightened. Reyes was the second soldier from that trial to end up critically injured under circumstances nobody could quite explain. The first one didn't survive. Sarah felt something go very still and very cold inside her chest. "You think Klein had something to do with what happened to Reyes today?" "I think," Marsh said carefully, "that a man facing federal exposure over a trial that was about to collapse had every incentive to make sure his star witness never got the chance to testify. And I think it's an extraordinary coincidence that Reyes was brought in already critical, from an incident report that's currently thin on details, to the one hospital where the man running that trial happened to be on shift." Farrow's face had gone pale. "Are you saying Dr. Klein arranged for Sergeant Reyes to be hurt?" "I'm saying it needs looking into," Marsh said. "And I'm saying that if Captain Whitfield hadn't been in that trauma bay this morning, Reyes might have died before anyone ever asked the question." Sarah's mind was already moving, fast and clinical, the way it used to move during mission briefings, assembling pieces, testing angles, discarding the ones that didn't hold weight. "The clotting agent," she said slowly. "If it's untested, unstable, that could explain the coagulopathy risk I was worried about. If Klein knew Reyes had already been given something experimental before he ever hit my trauma bay, wide-open fluids wouldn't just have been the wrong call. It would have been the fatal one. And he'd have known that." The alcove went quiet. "You're saying he wasn't just incompetent," Farrow said slowly, horror creeping into her voice. "You're saying he might have known exactly what would happen if he treated it wrong." "I'm saying," Sarah said, "that I want to see Reyes's full chart. Every medication, every trial document, everything Klein touched in the last 6 weeks. If there's a paper trail, I want it pulled before anyone has the chance to shred it." Marsh allowed himself the faintest, grim smile, the look of a man watching a soldier snap back into a role she'd been born for. "That's exactly the plan, Captain. I've already got federal investigators en route. But there's a complication." "What complication?" "Klein's already left the building," Farrow said, checking her phone with rising alarm. Security walked him out 10 minutes ago. And his personnel access to the research server, the one with the trial documentation, hasn't been revoked yet. IT is backlogged. It could be hours before anyone locks him out. Hours is more than enough time to delete a paper trail, Sarah said. As if summoned by the thought itself, a commotion broke out near the hospital's rear service entrance, raised voices, a door alarm shrieking, and a security guard's radio crackling frantically. He's in the server room. Klein's in the server room. He's not supposed to have access, somebody get. Sarah was already moving before the guard finished the sentence, cutting through the waiting room crowd with the same clean, economical stride that had carried her across a trauma bay hours earlier, except now there was nothing quiet about it at all. Sarah, Marsh called after her. Someone has to stop him, she said, not slowing. And I'm the only one in this building who knows exactly what he's hiding. Behind her, the lieutenant colonel fell into step at her shoulder without needing to be asked, old instincts clicking into place as easily as if 6 years hadn't passed since the last time they'd moved through danger together. Just like old times, Captain, he said. Let's hope not exactly like old times, Sarah said grimly, pushing through the stairwell door. Old times usually ended with somebody bleeding. The server room sat in the hospital's lower level, past a maze of maintenance corridors most staff never had reason to walk. Sarah moved through them the way she'd once moved through unfamiliar buildings on the other side of the world, fast, silent, reading the space 3 steps ahead of her feet. The lieutenant colonel stayed half a pace behind her shoulder, watching her back the way he'd once watched it from the open door of a Black Hawk. Doors propped, he murmured, nodding at the service entrance ahead, a fire extinguisher wedged crudely against the frame. He's not planning on being quiet about this. He's not planning on being caught either, Sarah said. Which means he's desperate. Desperate people make mistakes. Desperate people also do dangerous things. She pushed the door open slowly. Klein was hunched over a server terminal, tie loosened, sweat darkening the collar of his shirt, keys clattering against a USB drive as he fumbled to copy, or delete, it was hard to tell which, a folder of files labeled with case numbers instead of names. He spun at the sound of the door, and for a moment something raw and frightened flickered across his face before it hardened back into indignation. This is a restricted area, he snapped, as if that still meant anything, as if rank and bluster could put the last 12 hours back the way they'd been that morning. You lost the right to pull rank on me about restricted areas the moment federal investigators started asking questions about Halcorp, Sarah said, stepping fully into the room, calm and immovable. Step away from the terminal, Doctor. You don't understand what you're interfering with. His voice cracked, higher than usual, panic bleeding through the practiced authority. That trial, that funding, it kept this department running for 3 years. Grants, equipment, staff we couldn't have afforded otherwise. I didn't invent the corners that got cut. You just let soldiers get injected with something nobody consented to, Sarah said, and when one of them tried to blow the whistle, you let him end up on my table half dead, and you nearly killed him twice, once out in whatever incident put him there, and once again when you tried to treat a coagulopathy you already knew he had, with a treatment you knew was wrong. That's not, Klein started, but something in his face told her she'd landed exactly on the truth, and he knew it. Reyes told the IG everything 6 weeks ago, the lieutenant colonel said quietly, stepping into the doorway to block it. There's no version of tonight where those files disappear before investigators arrive, Doctor. The only choice you have left is how much worse you make it for yourself in the next 5 minutes. For a moment, Klein's hand hovered over the keyboard, and something desperate and cornered flared behind his eyes, the look of a man calculating whether there was still a way to salvage anything at all, whether one final reckless act might buy him an exit. Then his shoulders sagged, all at once, like a puppet with its strings finally cut. I never wanted anyone hurt, he said, voice small now, stripped of every ounce of performance it had carried all morning. I just wanted. He stopped. Even he seemed to realize, mid-sentence, how hollow it sounded. "You wanted to matter," Sarah said, not unkindly, though there was no forgiveness in it either. "You wanted a name on a wing, a grant with your face attached to the press release. And you were willing to let good people pay for it." Security arrived a minute later, radios crackling, guiding Klein out of the server room in silence, his career, his license, and whatever was left of his reputation unraveling behind him with every step. Sarah stood in the sudden quiet of the server room, the hum of cooling fans the only sound left, and let out a breath she felt like she'd been holding since the ambulance bay doors first burst open that morning. "You all right, Captain?" the lieutenant colonel asked. "He has a chance," Sarah said, thinking of Reyes upstairs, breathing steadily under careful watch for the first time in longer than anyone had realized. That's enough for today. 3 weeks later, Ashford Memorial looked almost the same from the outside, the same gray brick, the same buzzing fluorescent lights, the same scuffed linoleum. But almost everything inside it had changed. Reyes was discharged on a Thursday morning, walking out under his own power, slower than he used to, but steady. He stopped at the nurse's station on his way out, found Sarah restocking a supply cart out of old habit nobody had quite convinced her to break yet, and simply said, "Thank you for not letting me become another line in someone's file." "You're welcome, Sergeant," Sarah said. "Go home." He did, and word came a week later that his testimony, backed by the documents pulled from Klein's server before they could be deleted, had become the centerpiece of a federal investigation into Halcorp Pharmaceuticals, an investigation that would eventually result in the company losing its research license, and Marcus Klein losing his medical license permanently, along with facing criminal charges for falsifying consent records and endangering patients under his care. The hospital board didn't waste time correcting course, either. Denise Farrow, newly appointed interim director, called Sarah into her office not to discipline her this time, but to offer her something entirely different, director of a newly created veteran and first responder trauma program, built specifically to make sure no soldier walked through Ashford's doors and went unseen by someone who understood exactly what they'd survived to get there. "You'd get to use both," Farrow said. "Your medical training, your service, all of it. No more hiding one to protect the other." Sarah thought of Ochoa's letter, still folded in the drawer of her nightstand, worn soft at the edges from how many times she'd read it since. "Don't you dare disappear into some quiet corner of the world and let all of that go to waste." "I'll take it," she said. The program opened 2 months later, with a small plaque near its entrance reading simply, "In memory of Corporal Ochoa, who taught us that steady hands save lives." Walter Grimes, discharged and fully recovered, showed up to the ribbon-cutting anyway, uninvited and entirely unbothered by that fact, telling anyone who'd listen that he'd known there was something special about that quiet nurse since the very first week. "Told her so," he said, grinning, to a reporter who had no idea what he meant. "Told her so from the beginning." Sarah Whitfield didn't disappear again. She didn't need to. She had learned, finally, the thing Ochoa had been trying to tell her all along, that hiding your strength doesn't protect the people around you. It just means they have to survive without it, right up until the moment they need it most. Sometimes the bravest thing a person can do isn't running into danger. It's letting the people around you finally see who was standing beside them the whole time. If this story moved you, hit that like button right now. It genuinely helps this channel keep telling stories like Sarah's. Subscribe to Silent Heroes so you never miss the next one. And down in the comments, tell us this. If you were Walter Grimes watching Sarah for weeks before anyone else noticed, what do you think gave her away first? The next story is already waiting.